last speaker up, Car, if we can get this one up and running.
I'll just start in the interest of time, see how far we get without any support. The main thing that I'd like to talk about is what the Indigenous data network's doing to support other organisations in improving the cataloguing and representation of their data for the purposes of Indigenous governance. So there's been a program for several years, you've heard of it in bits and pieces today, funded through the ARDC and elsewhere, led by the Indigenous Studies Unit, with a bunch of partner organisations to improve the reference material that they use. So it's come out in several sessions, but for instance, if we want across Australia collections to better represent Indigenous content so that it can be found, we would do well to have standardised ways of doing that. So who's going to arrange those standardised ways? We've run a few experiments where we've gone to different state and institutional collections and just tried to find Indigenous content. And even when organisations have tried to make this feasible, what do? Do you search on keywords? Do you look in a collection called Indigenous Data? How you actually find Indigenous stuff, just that simple task is some places can be very organised, but they're different. And this is not good if you're looking for content across more than one institution. So there's at least one role which is for coordination in the ways of working to address these issues and in the reference material that we use. So we spent the last couple of years working on that, and for the remaining 11 or so months in this current phase, we're going to be going to the Indigenous Data Network's partners and working through this with them. Yes. Oh dear. Okay. No. I mean, I don't know how to get on there. Not really. So
sorry. The switching around is a little problematic.
So the issue is, folks, I can see it, but you can't see it. I just have to talk as best I can. Okay. So, in terms of the actual outputs of the project, we have a couple of different catalogues of stuff, but the main objective is not to make a new catalogue, it's to help catalogue owners to do things in ways that are common and best practice, etc. So one of the catalogues we made is a catalogue of reference material for other catalogues. So for instance, if you're going to indicate that something's Indigenous with a keyword, what keyword should you use? Well, it turns out that this is not the first time people have tried to do this, and in the states and territories and museums and so on, there are lots of Indigenous, Aboriginal, etc. keyword vocabularies out there, and they're not universal. So the South Australian Museum has a 27-part vocabulary of all the ways you might refer to something being Indigenous. It's not the same as in other institutions. So we have tried to put a bit of effort into harmonising, cross-linking these things so that if you see this term in this place, it's the equivalent of that term in that place, say. And the idea, of course, is that eventually we would like harmonious use of these kinds of terms, but this is by community agreement. So it's this community, people who are interested in Indigenous data governance, that need to really want to do things similarly. So that's just one kind of thing. But the major piece of work has been the recommendations around how you would catalogue stuff to enhance Indigenous data governance. And we recognise that we're mostly dealing with a field that is 90% done. What do I mean by that? Most places that are holders of Indigenous data have some form of catalogue. It might be a very formal multi-million-dollar system like Trove at the National Library. It might be the Jalkari keeping place on machines in Ngimbi. But there's some kind of system there. Many of them use software that we know and absolutely love, like Vernon. And then some of them use their own systems, some of them just use Excel, etc. So we're not usually talking about a place that's what we would call a greenfield site where there's no catalogue. That does occur. And when that occurs, we would like to assist as well. But we're mostly talking about enhancing what's already there to make it better perform for Indigenous data governance. So we have to make recommendations. What should you record if you happen to have EMU version 7? What should you put in there? How should you configure it to better represent Indigenous concerns? So there's a conceptual handling of what we think is important to know about if you're trying to deal with Indigenous data and govern it. And then there's the practical side of, well, okay, so we should have better linking to data governance policies. How do we actually represent that in a catalogue? One of the projects that's informative here is that the University of Melbourne is doing a broad-scale alignment of 26 cultural collections catalogues. So different parts of the University of Melbourne that have cultural information, and they are using a variety of systems. And they, some of them are medical, some of them, I mean, they're mostly cultural, but you know, they have all kinds of different systems and so on. And so we said, well, if you want to ensure consistency of Indigenous data representation, you must have some shared understanding of what it takes to represent information as being Indigenous or not. And then if you're going to do that, what does best practice look like in terms of actually enabling that content to be discovered, to be linked to the communities it's about, and ultimately for those communities to have a voice in actually dealing with the access to that data. So, that particular project is actually doing technical work now, and what we've done is we've presented them with conceptually what we think is a good idea, and we've said, here is a test case or a use case. This is something you can try. Can your system answer this question? And the question, I've phrased it differently a few times, but it's essentially a test. If someone says, look, I would like to access this item in your collection, how would the holder of that item negotiate that? Would they ask questions of you? Are you an Indigenous person yourself? Are you from the community that the data is about? Is the data Indigenous at all? There's these kinds of questions that we can test to see exactly how well positioned that institution is and how well their mechanisms deal with these questions. So we have a data maturity assessment that we can run. It's probably something like the RAN that you were mentioning before, maybe, where we assess how well set up that organisation is to answer questions about data management, and then within that, Indigenous data management. So, for instance, if they can't identify what's Indigenous and what's not, that's not good. If they can identify it, but that they can't work out which particular community it's about, that's better than not identifying it, but it's still pretty basic. If they can identify what community it's about, but they have no connection to that community, well, that's something. It's findable on those FAIR scores, but it's not well governed. If they have the information, they know which community it's from, they're in touch with the community, but they're not confident in their negotiations with the community, then that's something. But there's a sort of a hierarchy you can go through, and a score of how good an organisation is at actually performing these tasks. Now, one of the things that's come out in the work we've done over the years is the scariness for institutions at being assessed on this basis. So if you say to an institution, if an institution approaches the Indigenous Data Network and says, we'd like to work with you to improve our data governance, and we say, okay, let's do a data governance assessment of you and actually test out what you can and can't do. Sometimes they mean well, but this is scary. It implies cost and effort and embarrassment. And we've had to face real pushback from certain communities, mostly the academic representation communities, not the individual institutions, but the organisations that work with academia in general, to say, no, we don't do metrics, we don't do assessments, etc., etc. Well, we can't actually move ahead if we don't calculate and count and actually assess what's actually there. So if someone says, for instance, we'd like to improve access to Indigenous content in our collection, we have to assess how much content have you got and how accessible is it now. If we're not prepared to do that, we can't measure any improvement. So I'm an engineer, you may have guessed, I count things a lot, and we do have to count, and sometimes it can be embarrassing, and we are trading on the willingness of organisations to want to be involved and solve this. We don't have an ability to compel organisations to improve their Indigenous data governance. We don't have a law for that yet. If we did, it would be different, but it's a goodwill thing. However, we can report, I think fairly, that most institutions, certainly the ones that want to partner with us, but a lot of institutions are very well-meaning. What they need is guidance, and really they need to be assured that what they're doing is improving things, and is appreciated. So again, a secondary task for the Indigenous Data Network is to provide an intermediary between communities and non-communal data holders to say, these are things you can do that the community takes to be positive steps forward. If you write up an Indigenous data governance policy and indicate that your data is bound by that policy, even if you haven't actually implemented it, that's still a good thing to do, and yes, you should still do it. And we have a best practice guide that says this is a net positive thing to do. Without that, they might start to do things and then, as I say, become embarrassed and then actually pull away from doing this. So we have had a couple of institutions that very proudly said, we've done a great job with Indigenous data governance, here you go, here's our stuff, and we've looked at it and said, that's actually not that great. And then we didn't hear from them for a while. So that's actually problematic. We've burnt our goodwill there. So going forward, we think that we will have technical systems and reference material to present to organisations to help them technically in the task of Indigenous data governance representation. But the main thing is a hand-holding kind of assurance role to actually work with those institutions to encourage them to take steps forward, to use their goodwill, move things forward, and then we'll work with them to improve the situation. So that's a very touchy-feely kind of thing, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. What I would have shown you if I could have, but I won't because we're out of time, you literally can't see it. I did have some slides on just the effectiveness of bits and pieces of AI to improve metadata, in particular doing things like reading handwriting, etc. These things are just exploding, the systems are improving a lot, and we can actually improve metadata of, let's say, scantily categorized items in catalogues quite effectively now, and we need to do it carefully, but we absolutely must use those tools, and we seem to be using them. We need the non-Indigenous data communities to see us using tooling effectively to believe that we're up to the task of making inroads in digital data. Things are happening. I think I'm going to be out of time by the time that works.
We're way over time.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Thanks so much, Nick, and thanks for bearing with us these technical issues. Thank you very much for all our panellists. We've run out of time for even questions because we do have another panel before the end of the day. Hopefully the technical issues will be resolved very shortly. No.